I'm Nat, and every Thursday I deliver these webinars with my colleague April, and we talk about how the brain works, why the brain works, and how it relates to neurodiversity, the appreciation that the human brain is a diverse church and thinks differently, and how we celebrate it, and also how we haven't celebrated it in the past and the repercussions that may have to date. Sue says, London, I'm a teacher and a parent, and I have discovered I'm ND, having explored my children's ND. Very common, that is. Very curious to learn more. You're among friends today. Today, we are predominantly looking at autism. In fact, it is pretty much autism. A similar thought can be given to all the others, but we're using autism as our case example today. Again, there's a lot of things going to be quite transferable with other conditions that we've typically labeled, such as dyslexia, dyspraxia, and ADHD. Here's myself. I'm neurodivergent, and I have a master's in neuroscience. That's where I'm getting my background and information from today. Today has been heavily researched, and all the things will be resourced and referenced at the end, and also throughout the presentation. Do consider today as dipping your toe in the water, but there's much more places you can sprout off to after this. Autism, illnesses, disorder, differences, or other. Oh, we're getting controversial today. And before you get your out and be like, nah, it's not an illness. I'm not saying it's an illness. I'm saying people have considered it an illness, and whether or not we should as well. The same goes with disorder, difference, or is there a name that we haven't yet considered, which actually might be more appropriate? Our current understanding of autism predominantly goes down to the DSM-5 or the ICD-11, which are statistical manuals, what we use as our kind of Bible on understanding difference. Our current understanding is what we call the triad of impairments, which if you have social communication challenges, repetitive behavior and social sensitivities, and when they are combined, is a nice recipe for autism. It has always been that case. Before we had the triad of impairment, which was three things overlapping. The key thing here is autism is always changing. Our names have to maybe be updated to reflect that, or is it a better way of referring to it? Spoiler alert, autism is not an illness, but do we know why it's not an illness? That's also what we're going to be looking at. Not just because something is, but why it isn't. If successful, and we will be, the construct of autism as an illness, disorder, and neurodiversity. This is a cool little illustration which just shows you some of the current debate we're having right now. Most people are pretty satisfied with ASD being the standard official way of talking about it, but more people are starting to say ASC, autism spectrum condition. They're honestly the same thing, but they do have different connotations. For instance, disorder, you think of clinical terms. You think of manuals, you think of using research manuals. Where condition, you think it's quite popular, maybe I should start using it. You think, oh, it's a bit less negative. It's not perfect, but it's not a disorder. It also sounds a little bit more accepting. Right now, we've got a thing, do we go with what sounds nicer or what clinicians currently use? You tell me if you have a preference personally. I think it often comes down to what you do in life. Because in a clinical sense, disorder isn't overly negative. It's just a different way of processing. Dis as in different, order as in order. Alex said go with condition. Tell me why, Alex. Why is condition so much better? Is that a term we should all be using, or maybe just people within the community? We're going to have a lot of questions today. If you do have an opinion, share it. You can't be wrong in this, okay? It's a safe place. I encourage you to share what you think. My first question to all of you, and again, I want you to answer on how you truly feel, not what you want me to, or what you think others want you to say. How do you currently see autism? Do you personally see it as an illness, a disorder, or a difference, or maybe something else? I already mentioned the DSM-5, and though it overlaps, it's more American, it overlaps more with the ICD, the more European or the rest of the world version. There are also slight differences. For instance, in the DSM, you have levels like autism, level 1, level 2, level 3. It makes autism sound a bit like a video game, but it talks about the level of support needed, where the ICD-11 doesn't really talk about that. You either have ASD or you don't have ASD. Alex says, all should use it. Disorder, for me, suggests negative connotations. Yeah, so maybe you start off on the back foot already. Vikia, sorry if I pronounced your name wrong, may be a difference or even a condition. April says, I see autism as a difference because it's different ways of learning about the world around me. It's interesting, right? People did consider it an illness. However, they didn't call it autism, but probably would be of diagnosed autism today. Disorder is our official term, but I think maybe it has picked up negative connotations throughout time. I don't believe it was always seen in such a negative way. It was more on a very practical term. Difference, even though I like to say we are all equal, the truth is in our dominant society of neurotypical minds, we are the minority and we are different. But different can be interpreted both positive, negative, neutral, not at all. If you select another, what do you think we should see it as? Maybe a mental health condition, maybe an advantage, maybe we see it as a superpower. I'm not saying I agree with any of these, but it's good to start thinking about how we might refer to it. Emma says, I've never had a problem being identified as having ASD, but condition does sound more inclusive. Do you know what, Emma? I should come with you on that. I've got no issue with ASD. If push comes to shove, condition does sound a bit nicer. Some people have a problem with the word condition though. They're like, oh, I've got condition. You will never find something that pleases everyone. Alex says, when you meet one person with autism, you meet one person with autism. Classic. Great deal of difference across everyone. Maybe we should scrap autism altogether and just refer to people as neurodivergent because there are so many nuances and so many differences. Maybe this label, which we originally had different types of autism, we then collated to be just ASD to make it broader. Maybe it needs to be even broader still. I don't know about you, but how many people do you know who have just autism? Typically, we have lots of things. A label tells us very little of interesting information. There's this guy called Tyrer, and he's done some really great work. I recommend digging in deep to him. This is why autism is not a mental illness. A lot of people still see it as a mental illness. The name mental illness implies disease. Disease isn't something you're born with. Disease is something that kind of takes over and starts to degrade. An illness suggests something wrong that is fundamentally different from the normal function, is not just a variation in degree. Let's see how would autism apply to this. An illness is just something that is fundamentally different. Autism is different, but is it fundamentally different? I don't think so, but maybe you could argue that from normal function. For instance, a disease, I suppose you could call cancer a disease, right? That is definitely not how the body should work, how it attacks itself. Autoimmune disease, Crohn's disease, that's not how the body should function. But with autism, it just seems a different way of doing it. There's nothing fundamentally broken about autism. It's not just a variation in degrees. We already spoken about the DSM, how we have different levels of functioning. We talk about the autism spectrum and how it affects everyone differently. That is what we'd call a variation. Autism definitely doesn't fit the definition of mental illness. I think most of us can say, yeah, not a mental illness. Alex says, what is normal function? Normal to one person isn't normal to another. That's true, Alex. But I'd push back and say, in society, everyone's different, but we have threshold. And if you fit within a certain threshold, you will find life easier. And if you're outside of that threshold, life will be more challenging. While no one is normal, there is a norm. But that norm is related to the culture you find yourself living in. Being in the UK and being in Japan, or being in America, that normal is going to look different. It could be seen that in some countries you would be autistic and in other countries you would not be autistic, depending upon what they deem as normal functioning. I told you today it'd be interesting. Lauren says, what do you think about third-person language, as autism is also part of our identity, how we identify, not just something we live with? And on the other side, I think someone is different and identifies differently to language in general can be difficult. When it comes to, are you autistic or a person with autism? I think it's a personal thing. They have different connotations. One refers to, hey, I'm autistic, it's who I am, it's part of my identity. The other one is, I am autism, it's not just me, it's something that I have, it's not inherently me. You can use them interchangeably. You can use one if you want to make a particular statement, or one may just come a little bit more natural. I don't think there's anything particularly wrong, but what I will say, which I think is food for thought, whenever I do training with corporates or professors or lecturers, and I ask which language do they prefer, and bear in mind that predominantly are not autistic, they will say a person with autism. But when I speak to people who have autism, predominantly will say they are autistic. It's quite interesting how the community typically refers to themselves different to how others refer to them, even though both parties aren't trying to send any particular message across. It's all kind of subconscious. Madonna says, I say that everyone thinks differently, but autism is measured by certain parameters of differences. Yep, I think that's a good way of doing it. Alex, the issue is that a lot of rules and expectations are created by neurotypical people. Yeah, bingo. It is the majority creates the systems to work within their favor. And if you go outside of those parameters, you are going to be seen as less efficient. But imagine autism was the dominant way of thinking. It would be the neurotypicals who are arguably holding people back or stifling innovation. We didn't make our processes to be beneficial for everyone, and now we're paying the price for it. We are going on a bit of an educational journey in order to adapt that. But as we know, Rome wasn't built in a night. It's going to take time to just accept neurodiversity, but really appreciate it. With this in mind, I want you to tell me, do you think autism is an illness or not an illness? I don't think any of you said it was an illness to begin with, but let's say if you were a little bit on the fence, would that opinion have changed? Remember, an illness suggests something is wrong that is fundamentally different. Does that describe autism at all? I don't think it does. This illustration here shows quite easily that autism is genetic. It's something that you are born with. How your genes mutate, even when you're in your mama's tummy, depends whether or not you have autism or don't have autism, and also what that autism looks like. It's lots of tiny variations that kind of equal a difference. It's not a fundamental difference, because that's why we don't know what autism is, because it's so different, so many different genes. It's not just one singular gene. Quite simply, not an illness. I'm not the PC police here. People say, oh, now you're politically correct. No, I'm not. I'm just talking science. It's not an illness, and we can prove that. Emma says, not an illness. Maybe you'd say not cured, but embraced. Being cured is an interesting thing that we will probably look into a bit more. Lauren says, not an illness, however, due to society and some autism can affect us, are more likely to experience mental and physical illness. Yep, you're right there, Lauren. The illness does tend to go hand in hand with autism. There is a genetic link where you are more dispositioned, maybe that's the wrong word, to illnesses such as bowel disorders, believe it or not. You are more likely to have epilepsy. You are more likely to have depression. While it's not inherently an illness, there is still a link that you are more likely to gain something in the future. Never black and white, is it? Sue says, I've never thought of it as an illness, as an illness implies it can be cured or requires medication. That is true again. Illness does imply cure, but we know autism cannot be cured. Bear in mind, the future, we don't know what it holds. But even if we could, should we? I don't think so, but we're not there yet. We can do anything today. But you don't like your face, a bit of plastic surgery, you got a new face. You don't agree with the gender you were born with, that can be changed. Autism, nothing can be done about it at the moment. Maybe it could in the future. And if it could, would that change this debate? Or would the debate still be very similar? Hey, it's just a normal part of being different. But even if we agree that it is something which is beneficial to the world, for instance, having different, ways of thinking, genders, different facial, people would still choose to, for instance, go under the knife if it's a possibility. I know we're getting controversial here, by the way. Peter says, most of the ASC people I know have very high intelligence, i.e. top 0.1% IQs. At this end of the IQ spectrum, the probability of ASC does seem to be much higher than those in the general populations, although ASC does not necessarily imply high intelligence. I think you're right there, Peter. If you are really intelligent, you're probably more likely to be autistic. But being really intelligent doesn't mean you are autistic, because intelligence has a link with autism, but it typically does not. Because it is such a broad diagnosis, you can see how it gets really difficult to essentially pigeonhole it and to talk about it in a inclusive way that is actually accurate. I would say while I do like ASD and ASC, I personally think it's too broad to be beneficial. But again, just a thought. Now, if you look at Thomas Szasz, maybe I pronounced that wrong, in his book Myth of Mental Illness, he says the word disease, which is, let's face it, disease is not a nice word, denotes a, demonstrable, I like that word, biological process that affects the body of living organisms. That's quite graphic, since you think that is attacking the organism. Autism attacking us? No, it wouldn't be a disease, would it? The term mental illness refers to the undesirable thoughts, feelings, and behavior of a person. While we could probably say it definitely isn't a disease, could we say autism definitely isn't a mental illness if we're going with Thomas's definition? Because some people would say it's undesirable and they don't like the feelings and the behavior of a person. Whereas, let's face it, I hate using cancer as an example, but that's one of the worst things I can think of. Is it universally undesirable? Yeah, everyone hates it. It's definitely a disease. Is it a mental illness? No. Is any mental illness 100% undesirable? I think there's a lot of people who, while they would prefer not to have it, they understand that is life and they see benefits that come along with living with the condition or mental illness. I think autism does fit this particular definition somewhat, but because I would say there are just as many people who see it as a positive as do a negative, and the negative is definitely a societal construct than an inherent negative, probably it would be ruled out of mental illness. And I would also push back on people who think it is a mental illness by saying, in the characteristics of autism, the illness, or is it the conditions that go along with autism because living with autism is so difficult that create the mental illness? Alex says, if there is a discussion around changing, then that suggests that there is something wrong. I can understand that some people may want to have a cure, but similar to plastic surgery, this would be a personal choice. The world would be that you wouldn't know that the change results in, unlike plastic surgery. Yes, that is really true. I would say though, you don't really know what your face is going to look like exactly. But it's true, if you took the autism away, you have no idea who you would be. Sometimes I think back to the curious case of Phineas Gage, who was the railway worker who got a big pike through his eye and pulled it out, so he lost a part of his brain. He was fine. Or was he? No, he was a bit of a jerk afterwards because there was something missing. We don't know what is autism and what is not autism because it's part of you. You can't just take a little bit out. Interesting. Lawrence says sometimes news comes out on potential cures. Honestly, every other day there's a new article. As difficult as autism can be sometimes, I would not want a cure, as I wouldn't want people outside of the community trying to push for a cure on other people, or thinking that if they are different, you should be fixed. Yep, that is absolutely right, Oren. It's all well and good having these options, but other people will not want to have to deal with the challenges that having an autistic family member may entail and might push this on with them when they don't really want to change themselves. We know people are frequently coerced to do things which they might not agree with. Good point. With all this in mind, should autism be treated like a mental illness? You can see as we're going along here, the line between 100% yes and 100% no starts to get a little bit blurred. Everyone today says no, so it's not. We do not suffer with autism because mental illnesses are things people suffer from. If people ever say, oh, Timmy suffers from autism, Timmy does not suffer from autism. Timmy might really struggle with how society treats him with the autism, but it's not the autism. You're not just sitting on your sofa one day and be like, autism. No, autism doesn't hurt. What hurts is how people treat us. Autism is not a mental illness. You can gain a mental illness from being treated poorly because of your autism, but not due to the autism, if that makes sense. So yeah, not any mental illness. Glad we cleared that one up. If any of you disagree, by all means, call me out. Today is a discussion. There really isn't a right or wrong answer. There is a widely held considered right answer, but most things could be debated. If it's not an illness or a disorder, what is autism? Traditionally, let's go back in history because it has been a bumpy journey for autism. If we're looking at the DSM, Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, going back to the 50s, oh, damn it, we were schizophrenic. Mental health issues. It was mental health originally, but it was only in children. Adults didn't have autism. It was a subset of schizophrenia. Then in number 2, they just clarified it a bit more. Schizophrenia, childhood. This is almost in the 70s. Then infantile. So, finally, the 80s. It's not schizophrenia. We thought it was. It's not. It's not schizophrenia. However, it is still something you only get as a child, and also pretty much only males. Then, 7 years later, we decide autistic can be for everyone. Autism isn't just for children, but it is still seen as lots of different types of autism. You had autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, Rett's disorder. We still have multiple types. 1994, also autistic disorder, and this is how it remained for a long time. This is why when people talk about autism, they still very commonly refer to things like Asperger's, because that is what it was called for a large amount of time. It's only relatively recently, in 2030, where we started calling it ASD, the one name to rule them all. Though people still use ASC today, it's not an official term. It's just a colloquial one that people have started to pick up and discuss along the way. Alex says, that is the issue. Society needs to evolve into seeing neurodivergence as a typical evolution of a condition. As science and understanding improves, so does the language. Yes, I will say though, it changes at a very slow rate. For instance, did we know autism was schizophrenia before 1968? Yeah, but it took time for it to be implemented officially. Maybe we already know that calling it a disorder is wrong, but in order for it to change, a lot of different key stakeholders have to come together. Maybe there's a reason we don't want to soften the blow. Could there be an advantage in it being a disorder for big pharma? Honestly, medication. There's a reason why it's ridiculously slow to progress. Maybe I'm wearing my tinfoil hat on, but I do think the system doesn't want change if the current system has some monetary benefit. Maybe. Evolution is slow unless you are a creationist. Alex, another argument for another day. This brought us on to the neurodiversity movement. This could be the next way we talk about it. Let's just break it down. Neurodiversity is a descriptive word. It's saying brains are different. Then we've got the paradigm, which is more philosophical. Maybe it is advantageous to be neurodivergent. Maybe it is the next stage of evolution. It's something that we can ponder and think about and pull apart. Then the last one I want to focus on is the movement. This is a social action kind of campaign, a political stance. This is the belief that neurological differences as humans are natural, valuable, and not inherently pathological. Going back to Alex, to your point that society needs to evolve into seeing neurodivergence as a typical neurotype, you would absolutely be on the side of the neurodiversity movement because they see it as the baseline note. It is what it is. It's a normal part of being people. As you can see, we've got different mindsets, and this is why some people find the word neurodiversity a little bit controversial because they don't know if they're referring to neurodiversity, which is biological fact, a paradigm, which is more of a kind of debate, or the movement, which is a solid, held, firm belief. Next question is, there is nothing to treat with autism. This is building on about the neurodiversity movement. Do you agree with this? Do you think there is nothing to treat when it comes to autism? Agree or disagree? You should be finding these questions a little bit more difficult to answer now. Of course, would love to say there's nothing to treat with autism, but let's be real. If someone's born autistic and you do not give them support early on, their life is going to be a lot more difficult because of it. I had speech therapy when I was younger. Was there anything wrong with how I spoke? Guess not. But if I hadn't learned the skills, I probably would have struggled my entire life. Is there anything wrong with not making eye contact with someone? Not really. But if it means you're not going to get a job, shouldn't that be something you would treat or find support strategies? I can see as I'm talking, some people have been changing their minds. On the other hand, if society was more accommodating and more understanding, then maybe it would be the other side who would change their methods. Why do we put all the emphasis on one person and not the other? Should it be one-sided, either that way or that way? Or should it be more balanced? The different models are the medical model, which is our current system. This is disability is a problem. We need to fix it. This is where we say, I am a typical mind. You are an atypical mind. You're a pain in the bum when it comes to integrating with society. Have a label. We'll get you some help. Then you've got the social model. Social model doesn't really care for labels, but it does think that there's still a problem here. The problem is society. They are the ones who need to change. People with disabilities aren't the problem. It's the other. We need to support and accommodate. So for instance, putting ramps in people in wheelchairs because society made buildings that weren't inclusive. So we're going to have to be a bit respected and fix it. The neurodiversity model is like another stage. This is saying there's no problem here, everyone. Neurodiversity is the norm. We want to support wellness defined by people. We've got one person's problem, another person's problem, no person's problem. Is one of them right or wrong? I think they all have their merits. The medical model is really good at giving people a solid starting point in order to help someone. The social model is really practical because adjustments do need to be made. And the neurodiversity model is definitely the type of world that I would want my kids to grow up on if they were neurodivergent, which, let's face it, they probably will be. Sue says, it depends on how you view treatment. Most people assume it's to do with medication. I think the key word is support. I think you're right there too. I did purposely use the word treat because you do think something a bit more severe, but treat could be anything really. Peter says, sometimes a distinction is made between high-functioning and low-functioning presentations of mental conditions. The general public association autism with the low-functioning part of the spectrum, which is a gross distortion of reality. I agree with you, Peter. I think high-functioning, low-functioning is quite outdated because while it's not nice, I'll be quite blunt, I don't care if it's nice or not. I want the real answer. It's not helpful and it's not factual. Because it's not like you either can't do or you can do. It depends on what day it is, how you're feeling, your mood, how inclusive society is. I would say the social model, if there's no social support, you might be very low functioning, which means you can't operate in day-to-day life. If there is accommodation, you might be high functioning. This is why calling people a label because of how other people treat them just has never really sat right with a lot of people. Nothing is flawless, okay? What criticisms of the neurodiversity movement can you think of? We've been on a journey and now we've reached potentially the most progressive way of talking about the brain, but it's not perfect. Can you think of any reasons why neurodiversity movement may have the negative side of it? It's a bit too simplistic. It's all sunshine and rainbows because it's hard to separate autism from other conditions. There are some things that maybe should be treated. For instance, if you are someone who can't even communicate with the world, you'll forever be unemployed. You can't live independently. You're reliant upon the state for your entire life. Does that really sound that empowering? Divisive. Some people really struggle with autism and they do not want society just to accept it. They want action. If we accept it, we take responsibility away from our governments to actively do something. Reductive. It can take away from the challenges. These are really good points. Some people don't like it because the idea that thinking differently should be accepted. Not arguing with that. But thinking differently is a natural part of human evolution. That is what people get a little bit unupset about. They're like, well, I don't mind being supportive, but this ain't normal, okay? It's something that has gone on here. You've got different levels. You've got some organizations which are fighting for a cure. You've got other organizations which just want acceptance. You've got other people who are fighting for reasonable adjustments in the workplace or day-to-day life. But it still is a little bit contentious. Some opposing views is the belief that providing treatment is best. They're not bad people. They want to help their children. I'm not really blaming for that. But I think it's about if we help one person, should we then make sure help is mandatory? Big Pharma, those pesky devils, they make money off of disorders and labels. Big Pharma are the people who oppose it because they don't want it to be seen as an accepted part of life. A lot of people with autism will get like medication for, say, anxiety or depression. ADHD, this relates to a little bit more, which there is a lot of money in ADHD medication. It's not in the advantage of Big Pharma to support a model where diagnoses are pulled apart. Parents that have seen their kids suffer, if your kid has genuinely suffered, would you feel content just to be like, it is the way? Probably not. Some think it's only for high functioning. It really varies. If you are high functioning, meaning that you can probably go through your life without anyone noticing, you don't really want to show the world, make a big song and dance about it. But if you're really struggling, maybe some of the benefits, the superpowers we sometimes talk about, suddenly don't seem as super and as powerful as people made them out to be. I feel like a jerk because I told you all these things are terrible, built up to the current best way of talking about it. Suddenly it's not so perfect. That is the nature. Things are evolving and changing. The last question I want to focus a bit more on, functioning needs. The neurodiversity movement is only for those with low needs autism, or what we would call high functioning previously. Do you agree or disagree? Could you be intelligent and have very high needs? Yes, disagree. You can absolutely still be neurodivergent and have high needs autism. It's not about your IQ. It's about appreciating that brains think differently and all brains have things they can benefit society with. If we look at some extreme examples with autistic savants, people who are excessively intelligent, for instance, they might be able to recall any date in history and tell you what day it was. They might be able to look at things for one image and then paint it and draw it from memory. They might be able to be like a human calculator. Are these superpowers? They definitely sound like it. But what people don't tell you is they really struggled with social living, independent, communicating, daily eating, basic things they struggled with. This is why marking things by intelligence doesn't help. If you marked a savant by their mathematical abilities, smartest person on the planet, but if you measured them in terms of how they integrated in day-to-day life without any additional support, they'd score really lowly, really low. This old idea of autism on how it goes, in terms of the amount of support goes up, depending on the type of autism you have, is out of date. I want you to tell me if you agree or disagree with any of these. We're looking at concerns of any label at all. The first one is psychiatry is too heavily dependent on diagnostic classification. Agree or disagree? Poor validity of diagnosis. They're not even that accurate, to be honest. There's a lot of mistakes. Skepticism on the benefits of diagnosis. How certain are you that they're actually useful? Diagnostic has been used to justify civil detention. Essentially, we've been locked up in insane asylums. We've been electrocuted. We have been, being autistic isn't something to be taken lightly. Depending on when you were born in history, it genuinely could be a death sentence. We got psychiatry is heavily dependent on diagnostic criteria. Yep, a lot of you say it is. I think very true. Poor validity of diagnosis. Yep. Psychiatry is not perfect. It is observational, depending on each person's prior experience. There are guidelines, but there's a lot of room for interpretation. Maybe neuroscience might be more appropriate. Skepticism on the benefits. So you tell me, do you know someone who's got diagnosed? Was it a game changer? Did it change their life, or were they still struggling with the same challenges they did before? A diagnosis has been used to justify civil detention. It has. Maybe that's on the right far end. But even on my own personal journey, when you tell people you're autistic, they might put you in a lower set in school. They might withhold certain responsibilities because they think you're not able to cope. It does take away certain liberties, certain opportunities. The other thing with labels is that they change. As we talked about, autistic disorder, Asperger's, pervasive developmental disorder, they are changing, which tells you it's not an absolute fact. It's just current knowledge. In this moment in time, in this place in history, this label was created in order to give you the best chance in life. In the future, that may change, but it does show us, are we potentially setting someone up for future failure? For instance, you may not officially be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome now, but your life has already been shaped by that label up until this point. Let's look at Big Pharma now, and this is where they're going to come after me. Why do Big Pharma, we're talking about big pharmaceutical companies, like diagnostic labels? Money. They want it for the money. They're big advocates of the medical model. Is criticized for being dependent on the pharma industry. Pharmacological companies pay a lot of money to governments for advocacy and trying to win their favor. It's a business model. There's always going to be innovative treatments for common long-term conditions. Demedication is always getting a refresh every couple of years. Why? Because it prints money. Criticisms, a lot of the time, Big Pharma is accused of suppressing studies that show how labels are negative. What is saying here, maybe there's already a lot of evidence on why traditional labels are not useful, but will they ever see the light of day? Encouragement of new disorders and overdiagnosis. For instance, I've got dyslexia, dyspraxia. There's so many conditions. All the time we're coming up with new labels to call people. Where does it end? With every new label, there becomes new reason to treat someone. If you look at the amount of people who are diagnosed with ADHD, particularly in America, skyrocketed. I'm not saying people who have ADHD don't need help. Of course they do. ADHD is very real, but being overdiagnosed is starting to dilute it for other people who would genuinely benefit from the support. Food for thought again. There's an interesting manifesto from the Critical Psychiatry Network, which says this: the CPN shared concern about psychiatric practice where and when it is heavily dependent upon diagnostic classification. Psychopharma. What I'm saying there is that any sector which is relying on a financial system to support it is skeptical. There's always going to be bias. These concerns reflect recognition and poor constructive validity. How many difficult words today? Did I mention I'm dyslexic? So again, the key thing here is we can't trust it because there is inherent bias within our current system, which means there's always going to be suppression and elements of doubt. If you are interested in finding a new way to talk about it, Peter Kinderman has a really good book that I really enjoyed, was A Description of Psychiatry. He said this is a manifesto, so you remember a book of what he proposes should be done to an entirely new approach of psychiatric care. I appreciate this is mainly related to mental health conditions. However, I still think some of it can be applied to neurodivergence. So just a little disclaimer, one that truly offers care rather than coercion, therapy rather than medication. Distress is usually an understandable reaction to life's challenge. What we're saying here is a lot of the ways that the negatives that come along with a condition, maybe such as autism, are actually perfectly reasonable and understood. When it is loud and we are getting oversensitive, it is very rational and reasonable. Do you agree with Kinderman's view? What works better? Do you think care works better or coercion? So when we try and fix it. Yep, care. I can see we've got some lovely people in the group and you wouldn't be here today if you didn't genuinely care. But these debates are happening and it'd be interesting to have a bit more figures. What about therapy versus medication? If you could choose, which one do you think is most beneficial? You'll notice that I didn't pick a category for both. Sometimes having a more balanced approach is really beneficial, but I think most of us would prefer a holistic approach. I'm not saying medication isn't useful. Medication can be a lifesaver, and I am very grateful for the medication that's helped me. But why do we start with medication and not start with therapy and softer approaches and see if they work before we go on to something that we don't fully understand? What are the positives of an autistic diagnostic label? Are we coming full circle now? Oh, this is exhausting. All the new names suck. Let's just keep to the name we currently got at the moment. If we stick with what we got, what are the positives? You can call it autism, it doesn't matter what you call it. But is there still a positive with having a name that we can attach to it? Some people say, let's just crew labels altogether. Is there any positives on having something we can actually call it? Or is it better that we don't have a name for it whatsoever? Yes, autism as an umbrella of all autism types. So yeah, maybe just using autism. I think having a starting point to a conversation is incredibly useful. Imagine trying to talk about something that didn't have a name. Okay, I've got a brush here. I want you to tell me what this is without using the word brush. You might be able to do it eventually, but it would be unnecessarily convoluted. If you tell me a brush, you're not telling me what type of brush. I think this is a shoe brush. So you're not giving me the information I need, but one label is better than nothing. That's with autism. You tell me you're autistic, now I know that there may be additional support needs that you have and that I need to find out more. But without a label, maybe I can't help at all. Ability to participate in research and advance a body of knowledge, yep. It's a label that gets recognition scores. Yeah, to be honest, it's a label that works. Had I not had the label, I wouldn't have had the support. You might not like the current system, but that's the current system. Now I want to do a quick thing on do you agree or disagree again on reclaiming autism diagnosis. I know it's a bit jarring, we're going back and forth on what we actually want to do, but let's think about, could there be still some real usefulness in the current system? Disorders are appropriate to some forms of neurodivergence. We're saying here that maybe not for all of them, but for some, labels are good. We should get rid of some, but keep some. Differences between mental ill health and neurodivergence have been extravagant. They're not actually that different. There are differences, but we're not talking night and day here. A harsh diagnosis as an agenda for action is positive, while, say, disorder is, no one wants to be called disorder. Having a disorder does mean action happens. If you say, I have autism condition, maybe it sounds that you don't need support, but you actually do. Disorder has a specific meaning, which shouldn't be over-interpreted. Dis as in different, order as how things work. Maybe we're reading too much into it and should go back to what it actually means. What are the areas of improvement would we have the biggest impact on autism and other ND diagnosis? If there was one thing we could do which can help clear up this gigantic mess of understanding our brains, what do you think it would be? Would it be psychometric testing? Would it be neuroimaging? Would it be structured assessments? Or would it be having an update on our diagnostic manual? Interesting. Yeah, this manual does need a refresh. Team was the last one. Unfortunately, it's very bureaucratic. I read a book on the history of the DSM, and so interesting how they come up with it. It's very debated and very flawed. However, maybe it's better to have it than not have it. I think neuroimaging could be useful in the future. For instance, you definitely do not have autism, but that could also open its own can of worms. Psychometric testing, depending on what's related to jobs, I would say it's negative. Structured assessments, that's essentially how we currently do things, but maybe with a little bit more validity. A quick summary to wrap things up. It's complex. We don't have a direct answer. Simplistic terms are likely wrong. There isn't going to be a simple word. A ASD diagnosis is actually helpful in making sense of a person's difficulties and planning interventions. It doesn't give you the full picture, but it is still useful. While we may have different opinions, there isn't one model that truly captures everything perfectly. I hope you found this really useful. Do check out this lovely library of where we got the information from today. You will be able to re-watch this on recording once it's uploaded. If you are autistic, regardless of what you call it, whether diagnosed, not diagnosed, and in the UK, you can get a workplace needs assessment from us. We support only neurodivergent people get support in the workplace. You can watch our previous sessions via our YouTube. Do subscribe now. I'd love to have you. We're growing nicely and strongly. Oh yeah, nearly on 7,000 subscribers. Do check this out. We would absolutely love you to be a member of this community. As always, if you want to contact, by all means, admin at Exceptional Individuals or Nat at Exceptional Individuals if you want to contact me directly. There's my LinkedIn. You're very welcome to connect with me. I'd love to stay in contact. But thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Always an absolute pleasure to have everyone. Look after yourselves, okay?